Tonight's keynote is being delivered by Daniel Hannan. Daniel Hannan is a politician, he's a journalist, he's an author, and he has been a member of the European Parliament since the year 1999. He currently represents the South East England constituency for the British Conservative Party, and he's also the Secretary General of the Alliance of European Conservatives and Reformists. He has been a staunch defender of the ideas of liberty for many, many years and been active in the liberty movement for many, many years. As a true European, he is fluent in French and in Spanish, and he really loves Europe. He just has a few issues with the European Union and the European integration process. Now, he also, as I said, is an author, and will be selling his most recent book. It's called How We Invented Freedom and Why It Matters, for the sensational price of 10 euros, so you won't get it anywhere that cheaply. And you also have the benefit that Daniel Hannan will sign the books as well. So, and this book signing and the book selling will take place in the entrance hall where you all walked in at registration. So I can all recommend whoever's interested in that, whoever likes his talk, and I dare to say it might be a few of you, check it out at in the entrance hall. He'll be signing the books and selling it there. Quantities are limited. Now, in his keynote tonight, Daniel Hannan will try to convince us why someone who cares about liberty should also be Eurosceptic. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Daniel Hannan.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, to anyone of my age, Berlin is much more than a name, much more than a place on a map. The defining geopolitical event for my generation unfolded a few hundred yards from where you're sitting now. It was an event of epical significance. It was a Ragnarok, an Armageddon, or perhaps we should say, being in Berlin, a Gotterdammerung, except that there was no bloodshed. By an almost miraculous process, we saw the individual exalted above the collective, the law above the government, freedom over tyranny. It was the ultimate, what Donald Rumsfeld would call unknown unknown. Nobody had seen it coming. What Nassim Taleb would call the ultimate black swan. And for my generation, it was, well, I'll put it like this. If you ask what was our Woodstock, we who were born a couple of years after the actual Woodstock, all of us will give you the same answer. It was when Pink Floyd played The Wall at the Berlin Wall in 1990. An extraordinary time. It was also, I remember, a tour by the Rolling Stones of what were then, to us in the West, extraordinarily exotic places, Prague and Budapest and so on. I was luckier than most in that I had some opportunity to witness these events at first hand. I was on what in the United Kingdom is called your gap year. I had just left school, and it was a year before I started as a student. And so I had the opportunity to come and travel around what we still called Eastern Europe, to spend some time in Czechoslovakia, in the GDR, in the first half of 1990, that extraordinary time when free elections had been scheduled but not yet held, when the communist regimes were still notionally in power, but everyone could see the change coming. I fell madly in love with a British languages student who was here in this city. And as I traveled around, I had the opportunity to observe what was motivating the people driving the process of change and renewal. Freedom, of course, but something else, something more controversial, something less often acknowledged. Patriotism. Now, where I work, that is the dirtiest word in the dictionary. To invoke patriotism is like invoking ethnic hatred and war. And I know that there will be some good libertarians in this room who say we should be above all that, we're citizens of the world, and so on. Well, if you're an anarchist, I'm not going to convince you. But let me address those of you who believe in small government rather than zero government, those who believe in liberty rather than anomy. In order to function, the state has to have some basis in reciprocal obligation and affinity. There needs to be a connection between the people who pass the laws and the people who are expected to obey them. We need to feel that we have enough in common, one with another, to accept government from each other's hands. I think we have that sense as Portuguese or Swedes or Hungarians. I don't think we have it, as you'll hear in a moment, as citizens of the European Union. But whether or not that's true, let's acknowledge the values that this obligation, this common affinity, can bring. Patriotism doesn't mean that you look down on any other country or any other individual. On the contrary, it's what makes you behave unselfishly. It's what makes you recognize an obligation to the people around you. It's why I pay taxes to support strangers. It's why I obey laws even when I think they're foolish laws. It's why I accept election results even when my party loses. Take those things away, well, you don't have to look too far to parts of the world where it doesn't exist, and you see what follows. But anyone who doubts the morality of markets need only to have come to this city when I was here last, a quarter of a century ago. We often hear this from socialist friends, don't we? They say, okay, your system, let's allow, for the sake of argument, they say, that free markets are efficient. Let's accept that it's a good way of optimizing resources. Surely, they say, there must be more to life than markets. What about the important things, the decent things like friendship and family? Anyone who makes the argument that free markets are immoral only needs to think of the division of this city. I can remember crossing from one to the other when they were two separate political entities. Yeah, sure. Where we're standing now in East Berlin, it was poor. You went from a place where there were McDonald's to a place where the equivalent was a rather greasy sausage among two slices of processed white bread. You went to a place where there was no traffic. You went to the dinginess and grime and squalor of communism. But you also went to a place where you had the petty oppressions and humiliations that go with tyranny. Because that's where it always leads. Have this argument with left-of-centre friends and they'll say, oh, don't be ridiculous, you always quote the worst examples of socialism. Why are you always bringing up Cuba or North Korea or East Germany? Well, guys, maybe that's telling you something. Maybe there is a logic that leads from the ethic of coercion to this degree of absolutism. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. I think the best riposte to that is that, setting aside the obvious fact that people are not eggs, you show me one single instance of where an omelette actually resulted. It was a wretched, miserable, self-serving, squalid, oppressive system. You have it in higher or lower doses, but the essential flaw, the belief that you can coerce in the name of a greater good, that is constant. And now let me be as fair-minded as I can. Coercion is not only the ethic of socialism. It's the normal ethic of government for most people in most places at most times. The history of our species, at least since farming was discovered, has been a history of slavery and serfdom, caste and oppression. A small number of people get into power and they arrange the rules so that they will be able to loot the system and pass that privilege on to their children. It didn't take long after the agrarian revolution for people to realize that stealing somebody else's crop was a better ratio of effort to reward than growing your own. And the realization after that was that better yet was to institutionalize that theft through tithes and tolls and taxes. That was the birth of modern government. Government everywhere began as a racket. A modern African kleptocracy is not so very different in its politics from a medieval European monarchy or an Iron Age slave empire. If you get the chance, while you're in this wonderful city, visit the Pergamum museum on Museum Island. Look at what those Iron Age empires were like. Is there anyone here from Greece? Or anyone here from Turkey? I don't want to start any blood feuds among Greeks and Brits or Turks and Germans, but I have to say, looking around that place, our Lord Elgin was a pussycat compared to Schliemann when it came to carting off antiquities and taking them to museums. You walk around and it's very impressive. You see these magnificent triumphal arches and statues and so on. But think of what the system that built those represents. The deification of the ruler, hereditary slavery and concubinage. I'm going to do something that I don't think I've ever done before, but since we're in Berlin, it's the place. I'm going to quote a poem by Bertolt Brecht, because it came into my mind as I was wandering through the chambers of the Pergamum Museum, which is currently being redeveloped. It's called A Worker Reads History. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with names of kings. Was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? And Babylon, so many times destroyed, who built the city up each time? Imperial Rome is full of triumphal arches. Who raised them? Over whom did the Caesars triumph? My friends, ours is the only system, we who are privileged to live in law-based Western countries, the only system that elevates production over predation. We have uniquely found a way to hold our rulers to account. And what was the basis of that miracle that has happened only once in the 10,000 years since mankind discovered agriculture? Well, the great British historian Henry Maine had a lovely phrase for it. He said it was the move from status to contract. In other words, for the first time anywhere, instead of relationships being mediated by tradition or blood or caste or status, the individual was treated as autonomous, free to make contracts with other individuals on a one-off basis. And from that basic freedom flowed everything else. All the freedoms we now take for granted, all the things we regard as normal and comfortable in a modern society. Regular elections and uncensored newspapers, the rule of law, jury trials, equality between men and women, secure property rights, all of it goes back to this breakthrough, this revolution, the move from status to contract. Or again, since we're here in Berlin, the German sociologists called it the move from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. The same basic idea that instead of being treated as members of a collective, people were autonomous individuals. It's the foundation stone. Not the literal foundation stone of those arches built by the megalomaniacs of the Iron Ages, the slave emperors and the god kings, but rather the foundation stone of the structure of law and constitutional government that we have been privileged to inherit. Now, I tell you all these things because I want you to understand that my critique of the European Union comes from someone who values and admires the unique contributions that European civilization has made to the happiness of mankind. And foremost among those contributions are the rule of law, parliamentary supremacy, and individual liberty. That's what we mean by Western values. The rule of law. The government doesn't get to make up the rules as it goes along. It's bound by something else, something that you can't see or touch or hear or taste, but that constrains the ruler as surely as it constrains the poorest guy in the kingdom. Representative government. Wonderful, ennobling ideal that laws should not be passed nor taxes raised except by elected representatives answerable to the rest of us. And individual liberty. We should, as citizens, be as free as practicable from state coercion. Now, my problem with the European Union is directly in proportion to its abandonment and contradiction of those precepts. My objection to the European Union is not that I'm anti-Europe. As your chairman said, introducing me, I speak French, I speak Spanish, I've lived and worked all over Europe. Nothing fills me with more pleasure than coming to a city like this. I remember the British student studying in Berlin who I mentioned at the beginning. She's now my wife and mother of my 2 children, one of whom is here. I took them for the first time last night to see their first opera in Germany. Right? I'm not coming to what I'm about to say from any kind of nostalgic or insular perspective. My problem with the European Union is not that it's a group of countries that get together to do things in common and solve disputes and mediate problems among the member states. You'd have to be insane to be against that. Let's accept that we all think that that is sensible. My problem is that it's become remote and corrupt and cut off from the people it represents, and the reason that it is failing as a system is because it has turned its back on the values that once elevated and ennobled European civilization, the rule of law, democracy, and freedom. I realize that's a big claim, so let me take them in order, starting with the rule of law, with the idea that the government doesn't get to make things up as it goes along. Well, actually, let me give you just the most current example of how easily that precept is swatted aside in Brussels, and that is the Eurozone bailouts. They are prohibited in the clearest possible language. It's not just that they were not allowed under the treaties, it's that they were expressly forbidden. Article 125 of the European treaties could not be clearer. No member state, nor shall the European Union be made liable for the debts of any other member state. Right? And this was not some technicality, this wasn't some minor detail. It was on the basis of this clause that the public in Germany and other member countries of the Euro were persuaded to join the single currency in the first place. As Angela Merkel put it at the time, we have a treaty under which there is no possibility to bail out a member state. Well, the moment that that clause became inconvenient, it was swatted aside. As a friend of mine in the European Parliament said, the facts are ahead of the legislation now. Lovely phrase that. The facts are ahead of the legislation. It doesn't matter what the dots and commas of the treaty say. Christine Lagarde, the IMF, then the French finance minister, boasted about her readiness to tear up the rules. She said, we violated all the rules in order to keep the euro together. The treaties were very clear, no bailouts. If that were the only example, if that was some rare, exceptional hiccup or hiatus, maybe you could say, all right, extreme circumstances. But the truth is, this is the habitual approach of the Brussels institutions. We have a European Commission and a European Court of Justice that, just like those medieval kings, think that the rules shouldn't really apply to them, and that in the greater cause of deeper integration, they can make things up as they go along. I could quote any of 100 examples here, but just to pluck one more or less at random from the air. The rules, the developing judge-made corpus of EU rules on equality between the sexes. And the Treaty of Rome contains one line which almost everyone in this room would understand. Men and women shall be given equal pay for equal work, right? That's pretty straightforward. Okay? You don't have to be a lawyer to understand what that means. But progressively, starting in the mid-1960s, this was gradually extended. So first of all, equal pay was said to mean equal holidays and equal pension and so on. And then equal work was said to mean work of equivalent value. Right now, how is the employer supposed to assess that? Do you have to factor in the availability of suitably qualified employees? Just a question of whether they look as though they're working as hard as each other? And then it was developed further. Well, when we talk about men and women, it should also include sexual preference, because at the time we didn't really understand that sex also included sexual orientation. Now, I'm not saying that these are good or bad things. That's not my argument. My point is that when you've signed up to a treaty that says something very clearly, you don't expect the institutions that are the custodians of that treaty then to extend it beyond what any reasonable person would regard as a fair interpretation. A court with a mission is a menace. A Supreme Court with a mission is a tyranny. And why has it become a Supreme Court? Who was it who awarded the European Court of Justice ultimate jurisdiction even over the national constitutions of the member states? Why? The European Court of Justice. This was not agreed to in any of the original treaties. It wasn't in the Treaty of Rome. It wasn't in any of the subsequent amendments. But in a series of contentious judgments starting in 1963, the European judges awarded themselves the power to make rules directly for individuals in the member states. It is very hard to believe in the rule of law and believe in that system. But what about democracy? Surely the European Union, which brings together 28 parliamentary states, has to be reckoned a democracy. Well, not in its own structures. I mean, there's a very old joke in Brussels that if the EU were a country applying to join itself, it would be turned down because it doesn't meet the basic democratic criteria. What an extraordinary system. Imagine if you were not habituated by experience to it. Extraordinary system that takes 28 people, appointed, not elected, and in them combines executive and legislative power. Who would have come up with a system like that? If that was happening in Zimbabwe, we'd all be furious about it. And yet, we take it for granted. In fact, it's often said the European Commission is undemocratic in the sense that none of its members is elected. But actually it's worse than that. It's actually anti-democratic in the sense that you generally have to have lost an election before you are appointed to it. So it's only when you have been expressly rejected by your voters that you are invited to come and legislate for them. The supreme example in the current Commission being the President of the Commission, Mr. Juncker, who had just been thrown out by the electorate of Luxembourg after running the Grand Duchy for 18 years. Of course, if I were an aggressive federalist, to be fair, I would, if I imagine somebody putting the contra case, he'd say, yeah, but Hannan, you have the answer in your hands. You're a member of the European Parliament. Why don't you just have a properly federal democratic legislature at pan-European level? Well, the answer to that goes back to what I was saying about affinity and allegiance. Right? For democracy to work, people have to feel that connection. There has to be a sense of common public opinion, common media. Otherwise, the institutions become detached from the people they govern. Now, you're obviously a fairly political crowd, right? Here you all are in Berlin at the European Students for Liberty conference. I'm guessing that in your home countries, when there is a general election, you're keen on staying up until you've seen the result come in on TV. Hands up anyone who can honestly tell me that at the last European election they were glued to their television, not wanting to go to bed until they had seen whether the Party of European Socialists or the European People's Party had the majority. Right? One person. Okay, you're very brave to admit that. Thank you. It just shows what a heterodox and diverse group of students you are. And that's probably about the right proportions. I mean, that's 1 out of 700 people here. That's probably about what it is in Europe. Okay? Now, I was elected the first time on a turnout of 24%. More people voted the following day in the eviction round of our version of Big Brother than participated in the election that returned me to the European Parliament. I could take that very personally, but the truth is, people just don't feel European in the same sense that they might feel French or Austrian or Italian or whatever it is. And if you don't have that sense, you can't create the institutions and pretend that it will follow. The Soviet Union, with police powers beyond anything that even the most extreme bureaucrat would dream of, spent 70 years trying to fabricate a sense of common Soviet identity where you'd all go and have your holidays on the Black Sea, whether you were Estonian or Kazakh or whatever. The moment people were given their freedom, they chose to opt for amicable separation. You can have a supranational state. You can have a Habsburg or a Romanov or an Ottoman state until it becomes democratic. You can't have both at the same time. There has to be that connection, that sense of demos, of identity about whom we mean when we use the word we. If you take the demos out of democracy, then you're left only with the kratos, with the power, the power of a system that has to compel by force of law what it dare not ask in the name of civil engagement. But I'm not just making a point about the EU itself being undemocratic. That is, I don't need to make that point. That's measurable. That is empirically visible in the turnouts to the European Parliament that have fallen without exception. Every single European election since 1979 has resulted in a lower turnout than the last one. So we've already tried the federalist idea that if you give MEPs more power, you attract a higher caliber of candidate, you get more people voting and so on. We know that the opposite is the case. Let me make a different point. It's not just that the Brussels institutions are undemocratic in themselves. It's that they traduce and prejudice democracy within the participating member countries. We just had a general election in Greece, and the German finance minister, Mr. Schäuble, responded to them with a phrase that, although he was speaking only about that country's elections, could apply to the European project much more widely. He said, "Elections change nothing." This is not just a system that swats national referendums aside when they go the wrong way. This is not just a system that concentrates power in the hands of unelected people. It is a system which requires you to give up a measure of your internal democracy in order to comply with the requirements. As Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, said, also talking about the Greek elections, there can be no democratic choice against the treaties. And he meant it. The one policy which the incoming Greek government had elevated above all others, namely that they would stop the bailout and borrow racket, was dropped. There can be no democratic choice against the treaties. You think that that's extreme? Cast your minds back to 2011, when in Rome and in Athens there were, in practice, Brussels-backed civilian coups. Elected premiers were toppled and replaced by bureaucrats who had never stood for election in their lives, respectively Mr. Monti, the former Vice President of the European Commission, and Mr. Papademos, the former Vice President of the European Central Bank. They headed what were called national governments, but these were governments put together for the sole purpose of driving through policies that would have been rejected by the nation in a general election. Now, I know that there is a tendency among some libertarians to say, yeah, well, good, democracy is a very dangerous thing, it leads to majority rule and so on. Who was it who created the euro crisis? Was it a great demand from the public? Was it a popular, demotic campaign to surrender the old currencies and join the euro? Or wasn't it the technocratic elites who created this monster? At every stage, the experts have made worse mistakes than the general population. I think the truest conservative statement arguably ever uttered was Bill Buckley's sublime observation that he would rather be governed by the first 1,000 names chosen at random out of the Boston telephone directory than by the economics faculty of Harvard University. And given the way things have worked out, who can doubt that he was right? If you want an example of how you trust the people and they respond, look at the most democratic country in Europe, namely Switzerland, where power is devolved, dispersed, decentralized, and where decisions are habitually taken by referendum. Switzerland has the freest economy in Europe, the 5th freest economy on the planet. It is the wealthiest country in Europe, and according to the UN, the best place in the world to be born. The combined cantonal and state spending in Switzerland is below 35% of GDP. Do you know what? If you trust people, it works. They become wonderful statement that Margaret Thatcher's guru Keith Joseph used to make. If you give people responsibility, they behave more responsibly. Now contrast Switzerland, where people have been made to understand that their future is in their hands, with Greece, where people have been systematically infantilized, where the electorate has been encouraged to see all economic problems as Brussels business. Which of those is, from a free market point of view, the better or more attractive alternative? So, rule of law, no. Representative government, no. But the big one is personal freedom. I wish I had a euro. I was going to say I wish I had a euro. I wish I had a pound, because I don't know what's going to happen to the euro. I wish I had a pound for every time that I have heard the same answer from my colleagues in Brussels when I ask, why do we need this new regulation? Can anyone guess what the response is? It's the same every time. It's always the same. Because we don't have one, right? You'll say, why do we need this rule on banking, on herbal remedies, whatever it is? But the existing system is unregulated. And you realize that in the mind of the Eurocrat, unregulated and illegal are synonymous terms. The idea that absence of regulation might be the natural, let alone the desirable condition, the default setting, is beyond their mental horizons. There is almost no field of government that is ignored by Brussels officials. There is no nook or cranny of national life so obscure that it has escaped their attention. They have rules on how loudly you can play music in the workplace, on what you can plant in the ground, what you can fish from the sea, on the correct way to hold a ladder against the wall, on what you're allowed to buy, whom you're allowed to employ, on what terms, what terms you can work for other people, etc., etc. Nothing is too small. One of the products of that happy union with the British student in Berlin is here in the audience tonight, my elder daughter, and I can date the moment of her conversion to Euroscepticism. It was when she learned that I am required by law to drive my children around in car booster seats until they reach the age of 12 or a certain minimum height. Now, I had been frankly looking forward to discarding the wretched yogurt-encrusted blobs at a much earlier stage than that. I speak obviously of the car seats, not of the children. Some of you may think that makes me a very bad father. Some of you may agree. That isn't the point. I'm not saying that it's a good or a bad rule, but how did we reach the point where that kind of issue is legislated for 600 million people and imposed uniformly at continental level? And what goes for car seats goes for almost everything else. I was recently involved with the Brussels ban on alternative remedies and herbal medicines. Now, views on the efficacy of herbal medicines will differ in this room as everywhere else, as indeed in my family. My wife swears by them, thinks that they're much better than conventional medicines. I think that they are a harmless placebo. But whether or not you think they work, they plainly don't do any harm, right? There's such a thing as the benefit of the doubt. We should start from the proposition that herbalists are not setting out to poison their customers. It is a bad business model. So why did the European Union set out to criminalize a harmless activity pursued by more than 20 million Europeans? As I say, I was skeptical about this, but as King Solomon tells us, it's better to have a dish of bitter herbs in a house where there is love than a stalled ox and hatred therewith. And never perhaps has the bit about the dish of bitter herbs applied so literally as in this case. So I went along with it at my wife's prompting. Where was the pressure coming from? This is the point that I really want you to get. Who was driving the process of banning these little herbalists? I'm sure some of you have already guessed. All of the lobbying came from the big pharmaceutical corporations because they saw an opportunity to create a regulatory regime that they could easily afford to comply with, but that would put their smaller rivals out of business. And that is what I see again and again where I work. Almost every month I come across some new example of it. You know, there'll be a directive on mineral water. And the idea of a free market, the idea of free exchange and mutual recognition of products is that if this bottle of mineral water is legally sold in Germany, it should be legally sold in Italy and Britain and France and vice versa, right? We all understand what free trade should be. But that, of course, is not the EU's understanding of free trade. What they will say is, in order for it to be called mineral water, it has to contain the following minerals, but mustn't contain any of these. The volume of the bottle has to be not greater than X and not less than Y. And you will then often find that a producer which was doing no international trade at all suddenly finds that its goods are criminalized even within its own borders. And why? Because one manufacturer or one cartel or consortium of manufacturers who happened to meet all of those specifications anyway saw an opportunity to disadvantage their competitors. They know how difficult it is to get these things through national parliaments, right? No national parliament would have banned the higher dose vitamin and mineral supplements and the herbal remedies. There was too much popular resistance. But if you take it that much further away from the public, you can do the deal in, well, I won't say smoke-filled rooms, but smoke-free rooms these days in Brussels, and you can get away with it. So, if you believe in the freedom of the individual, if you believe in the rule of law, and if you believe in the supremacy of Parliament, I submit it is impossible not to be critical of the current Brussels system. And saying so doesn't make you anti-Europe, right? If France were run in this way, if it were ruled by 28 unelected commissioners who, as a result of their immunity from public opinion, had come out with such disastrous failures as the overregulation of small businesses, the common agricultural policy, the common fisheries policy, and the rest of it, I hope you would all be against that too. That wouldn't make you anti-French. It wouldn't make you Gallo-skeptic. It would make you Democrats. Freedom, the rule of law, democracy. Now, there are then two last-ditch arguments that are brought out by my Euro-integrationist friends at this stage. Prosperity and peace. Well, prosperity not so much in the last couple of years, I have to say. I've noticed that they've gone a little bit quieter on that one. The year that the United Kingdom joined the European Union, 1973, Western Europe was 38% of world GDP. Today it's 24%, in 10 years it'll be 15%. And why is that decline happening? I mean, sure, they've exacerbated it with the euro crisis. They've made virtually every mistake in the book on that one. But it was a decline that began long before. It's partly demographic, but of course it's also partly to do with what happens when you destroy competition. The chief constraint on big government is international competition. You can raise your taxes up to a certain point, and then people start going abroad. I was living in Brussels when François Hollande took office in France. I remember this influx of people coming to my street because you can go from Brussels to Paris in little more than an hour on the train. In fact, there was only one Belgian left that I still knew on that street, and I remember her saying to me one morning as I left the house, she said, "Monsieur le député, you're in politics, you can maybe answer me this. What kind of hell are these people fleeing if they regard Belgium as a paradis fiscal?" Oh. In a way, Hollande was reminding us of something that I think all of us know, which is that wealth taxes don't redistribute wealth, they redistribute people, right? And hence the opposition of Hollande and the people like Hollande to having this degree of international competition. Hence this obsession in the European Commission with tax harmonization, with an end to social dumping and all the rest of it, because if you take that competition away, you are able to get away at home with a much more intrusive and unwieldy state. And it's the same thing with employment law, social benefits. You can give your workers the most generous maternity leave and paternity leave and mandatory holidays and all the rest of it up to a certain point. Then the factories start relocating, the jobs start going abroad. But if you can export your costs to your competitors through European Union regulation, then you can engorge the state without any payback. Now that thinking might conceivably have made sense in the 50s when the European Union began, the European Economic Community. But in a world where competition is coming from China, from India, from Indonesia, from Brazil, it fails even in its own terms. I don't think we hear so much about the European Union being a guarantor of prosperity anymore. I mean, it seems an extraordinary thing that when the euro was launched, it seems to belong to another world, this. We were told it will add 1% GDP growth to all participating economies every year in perpetuity. Now, as Sarah Palin might put it, how's that working out for you? But the euro brings me on to the second, and this really is the last-ditch argument. When I have these friendly conversations with Euro-integrationist friends, they say, all right, Even if you're right about the corruption, about the waste, about the expense, let's even allow that you're right about swatting aside the inconvenient referendums. Surely it's better than shooting at each other on the Western Front. Right? And that's the trump card. Now let's just analyze this for a moment. Stand back and ask yourselves this question. Should we think of the European Union as a cause of peace in Europe? Or wouldn't it be more accurate to think of the European Union as a consequence of a European peace that was based on the defeat of fascist governments, on the spread of democracy, and on the NATO alliance? Peace correlates with a number of things. It's not quite true that no two democracies have ever fought each other. You can find the odd exception. Israel's invasion of Lebanon, the Peru-Ecuador war, there's the odd exception. But as a general rule, democracies are much less likely to make war on each other. But the real biggie, you all know this because you're the European Students for Liberty, the biggest correlation is between peace and free trade. As Frederick Bastiat is supposed to have said, when goods can't cross borders, armies will. If you have no tariffs and no non-tariff barriers, then what does it matter whether the diamond mine is in your country or somebody else's, because you can buy the diamonds at exactly the same price. So on what bizarre calculus would it make sense to expend blood and treasure in a project that is not making you any better off? The great guarantor of peace is bringing people together. As Milton Friedman put it, the market is the best way to make people who don't like each other deal with each other. He said that before Twitter. Obviously, that's an even better way. But you get the point. The European Union came in a context where tariffs were falling globally. There has been no war between the US and Canada over the same period. And do you know what? For the same reason. They don't need a commission and a parliament and a court of justice in order to ensure that they don't invade each other. When two countries have a relationship based on trade and are answerable to their electorates, you tend not to get peace. I'll go back and make the point in another way. Look at where the hotspots around the globe are today. Look at where the wars are. Imagine a map of the world in your mind, right? South Sudan, Chechnya, the secessionist parts of Indonesia, even the Balkans, Israel, Palestine. The biggest cause of war today is people feeling that they have, so to speak, been enrolled into the wrong state. They are secessionist or irredentist campaigns from people who feel that they don't have the basic connection between themselves and the majority of the country in which they're citizens. So ask yourselves this question: does jamming different nations together into a single political structure make them get on better or worse? And if that question seems too abstract, let me ask it in a more specific form. The most extreme integrationist project in the whole of the history of the European Union has been the euro. Is that making people get on better or worse? Look at how Greek newspapers now refer to Germany, and to some extent the reverse. Would you say that it is soothing or stoking national antagonisms in Europe? Isn't it better to live as peaceful neighbours than as constantly bickering tenants? I said I would make this case as a European, and so it seems only fair, closing as I am in Germany, to close with the words of Wilhelm Röpke, the great liberal German economist, one of the first of his countrymen to see through the Nazi barbarism, and one of the first Europeans anywhere to see where the European project would end. He said, "In antiquity, Strabo spoke of the many shapes of Europe. Montesquieu was to speak of Europe as a nation des nations. Decentralization is of the essence of the spirit of Europe. To weld the continent into a bloc and govern it centrally is a betrayal of Europe and of the European patrimony, and a betrayal made all the worse for being carried out in Europe's name." My friends, you are the custodians of the liberal tradition in this continent. Grant freedom and much follows. Deny it and much is lost. Status to contract. Go back to the autonomy of the individual, and all of the other good things that we appreciate will come as naturally as night follows day. Deny it, well, look at most countries, at most times, in most places, and you see what happens when you take freedom under the law away. That's your peculiar inheritance. You are privileged to have inherited from your parents that sublime patrimony of freedom. And that carries with it the responsibility to keep it intact and pass it on safe to your children. And now abideth law, democracy, and freedom. These three. But the greatest of these is freedom.
Giga Tea, crowdfunding for you and me.